We're joined with the man himself. I would say the voice of wisdom and truth. He hates when I say that, but at the very least, he does a damn good job at analysis. Mark Sleboda, my man. How you doing, Mark? You doing okay?
Jamarl, thanks for having me. I'm alive. Thanks for having me. It's always an honor and a pleasure to be on the show.
Happy Easter, man. There is construction upstairs that I did not know about, so I'm going to have you on mute. I'll bring myself in just to ask a question or something like that. I really thank you for joining me. I'm going to do this on air. There have been people who've helped me with this channel, and you have been one of them that have. My appreciation for you is astonishing and radical, and I just wanted to say it on air. I said it on the show. I said it to you personally, but there are several guests who stuck with me from the very beginning of the show, even through the first 2 weeks where it's just a mess, calamity. Thank you. So you have my appreciation for it.
Tomorrow, knock it off. Knock it off. We've been having this conversation for
I know,
years.
but I still appreciate it. It's hard for me to get that appreciation across because you could have on the first week be like, I'm done with this. This is a cluster. But I'm not gonna beat it around. I'm not gonna beat it around. I want to get your take on something. So Donald Trump has come out, and I'll use propaganda outlet in order to even show the story. Kiev, quote unquote, independent, comes out. U.S. proposes leaving the occupied areas under Russian control, easing sanctions. This is what Bloomberg is reporting. This is apparently what Witkoff and Rubio communicated to the Europeans. No NATO, also. The Europeans obviously were like, we don't like this. We're not for this. And even, of course, Zelensky has been flipping out, yelling that Witkoff is working with the Russians, that Vance is working with the Russians, that this is outrageous. We're never going to accept this. And there was a really interesting part in the New York Times on this, where the New York Times points out that one of the things also is the denazification of Ukraine, which they interpret as removing Zelensky. Fascinating. In fact, saying, this is outrageous that Donald Trump is proposing this. And then I thought, this is still not enough though, right? Like, because one of the other elements is freezing the conflict. And they are not going to allow the freezing of the conflict. That's one of our red lines, right? All of these regions are ours, and the troops need to leave. Or is there wiggle room in that? Where, look, under normal circumstances, negotiations are taken with maximalist point of view and whittling your way in. From my point of view, most of Russia's demands are not maximalist. They're rational from the point of view of Russia in regards to security. Is freezing the conflict, though? Is there wiggle room in that? Freezing it across the current lines? I want to start there because that's what's being put out in regards to the Trump's offer. What are your thoughts?
I think that it is admirable that the Trump team has come to where Russia was in 2015. There's so much gulf between the positions at this point. It's almost laughable. I mean, it's just amazing that this echo chamber of Western conversation that they've been having, furiously arguing each other, whether, to recognize that Crimea is part of Russia. Full disclosure, my wife is Crimean, right? I've got family in Simferopol. They've been part of Russia officially since 2014, as far as they're concerned, and really much longer before that, right? I mean, they as far as they're concerned, they've always been Russian. So, I mean, have I told you the story of how I met my wife?
You haven't, actually. I assume you were in the military or something like that.
No. I had already been out of the military, and I was working for a semiconductor company in Boston, and I was at a goth fetish nightclub that was wonderful in Boston at the time. I was a weekend goth. Yeah. Full disclosure. And I met my future wife there. She is from Crimea, from Simferopol, but she had gone to university in St. Petersburg, and she was had already gotten her Russian citizenship. technically she was still a Ukrainian citizen as well, although she never viewed herself that way. And we came across each other in the club, and we started talking, as one does at clubs, as such at that age. And I heard her voice, and I said, you're from Eastern Europe somewhere, right? And I said, I've got Eastern European roots, my family. And she says, yes, I'm from Crimea. I says, oh, you're from Ukraine. And she slapped me across the face.
Are you serious?
Actually, I said, you're Ukrainian. And she slapped me across the face. And it was love at first slap. And that was my first introduction to Crimean and Russian Ukrainian identity politics. And
that's fascinating.
It's been a long, long road since then. Anyway, it's of course very complicated. And my wife's own family, I mean, their surname is actually Ukrainian, right? It ends with an O, Nichitailo. And they're mixed, right? It's like most families in Eastern or former Eastern Ukraine and Western Russia. You scratch one Russian Ukrainian, it's really hard to say where one line and what is really ethnic Russian, ethnic Ukrainian in that area. It didn't mean anything in the Soviet Union, and there's question of how much it meant anything in the Romanov Empire. But her family regarded themselves as Russians, right? Or as part of the Russian world, the Ruski Mir that sometimes that Russians speak about with great fondness, and the Western media tries to mean as some type of Giga Chad imperial redux idea. Her family, they regard themselves as Russians. They're Russian speaking, right? They whether they attended the Ukrainian Orthodox Church or the Russian Orthodox Church, they regarded themselves as Orthodox believers. That's they viewed Russians as at farthest a brother people removed by a modern political border that sprang up, and no one really believes in it or thinks it means anything, right? But it's there. So for the Trump administration to catch up with the Crimeans on that, much less completely ignoring, of course, the very similar opinions by the majority of the people in the Donbass, and what has become the majority, particularly since the Maidan and the conflict and 2022 began, the Russian intervention in the civil conflict, the people of Kherson and Zaporozhye feel. And that also being said, my wife's family is from Crimea, but they also have relatives. So we have relatives in Donbass, in Kharkov, in Odessa, and I can tell you that absolutely none of them, have supported what has happened in their country, right, since 2014, since the overthrow of the government that they had all elected, that Eastern and South Ukrainians had overwhelmingly elected, by an openly and unquestionably Western-backed putsch, with Western politicians, including John McCain and Baroness Ashton and all these others, literally on a stage that was calling for the overthrow of the government and so forth. I mean, the fact that Yanukovych even allowed that to transpire, that's a an utter condemnation as far as they're concerned, in his weakness and how far Ukraine had already fallen at that point. But how deteriorated the Ukrainian state began. But whatever Yanukovych was, yeah, he was corrupt, he was weak, but democracy is always, even in the U.S., they acknowledge it's a choice of a lesser of two evils, and unfortunately, in most locations, unless you're in Italy, and then it's the lesser of 118 evils. But they chose that evil to prevent the other evil that from the other side of the country, at least represented the view of Western Ukraine, from seizing power. And the tenuous state of fragility of a Ukrainian state since 91 was kept by the balancing between both the internal and the external east and west of the country, the identity, the geography, the geopolitical, right? But when it was enshrined in the Ukrainian constitution, neutrality, i.e. Ukraine could join neither NATO nor the Russian-led CSTO, that kept the peace in the country, right? Because it was called Ukraine since the end of the Soviet Union. The Ukrainian language was considered the state language, but Russian, particularly in East and South Ukraine, at least up until 2014, had widespread unacknowledged or local official status as the government language in the east and the south of the country. And even if people felt themselves as Russian in eastern Ukraine, it didn't really matter so much as long as Ukraine was neutral. That was fine. That was okay. And if they could improve their perennially terrible economic relationship, economic conditions, and hopefully reduce the rampant corruption in the country that had reigned since 91, the control of the oligarchs, the control of politics by the oligarchs, as well as the economy. If by joining the EU or moving towards joining the EU, that could be improved, well, that probably wasn't a bad thing, right? As long as that's all that it entailed. But when it became clear, right, with the events leading up to the Maidan, as the top EU officials put it, right, Ukraine had to make a civilizational choice. They had to. There could be no more gray area, no more neutral space, no more buffer between everything. Right up to Russia's border had to be subsumed into all of the Western structures, not just the EU, but NATO, because they're really just different parts of the same supraorganism. And that's when, the alarm bells started going off. We already had a free trade agreement with in Ukraine with the countries of the Commonwealth of Independent States. So if we follow this EU association agreement, we're supposed to rip that up. I mean, that already started rubbing people, the wrong way. And then when they got this hundreds of pages of neoliberal diktat that was the EU association agreement, that basically called for ripping up their economy from the level down to the railroad tracks in the country and replacing them, and privatizing all of the state-owned enterprises in the country, which would have literally unemployed more than 10 million people, with no funds, no money from Europe to Ukraine to ameliorate the effects of this. Well, that's when Yanukovych said, yeah, I can't do that. I mean, no one can do that, right? No one, not.
Well, he said he wanted a pause, if I'm not mistaken, right? Or am I getting that wrong?
What?
He called for a pause.
Yeah. He didn't say no. He basically said, yeah, we need to renegotiate. Not now, not under those conditions. It doesn't mean, but that was already, the signal. That was the government is to be overthrown then, and all of Ukraine is to be dragged kicking and screaming. And then, of course, they lustrated the party that had won the last elections in the country, right? They were denuded from the Rada, right? They were ripped out of the Rada, along with all of the leftist parties in the country, the Communist Party of Ukraine, which was still quite strong, all of the socialist parties, right? All of these were almost immediately banned and removed from politics. And what it effectively did is it absolutely silenced any vote of opposition, any to the Maidan pro-Western geopolitical project. There would be no limitation on it, because there was all of the existing opposition in the Ukrainian parliament, the Rada, was completely and immediately silenced. In 2005, there had been the Orange Revolution, right? And then there was this contested election, and they held it again, and it was really just as crooked as the first time, but more slated towards the fixing in Western Ukraine. But the ability of that new regime was still limited by all of the existing opposition representing East Ukraine in the parliament. And the next election turned around and they voted the bum out, right? And Yanukovych was fully elected. And so when they launched the Maidan, right, the revolution of dignity, as they call it, because some people get dignity and others don't. I mean, that's the beauty of that catchphrase, right? Western Ukrainians, they get dignity. Eastern Ukrainians, suck it up. You would get to play along, and that is there could be no revisiting, no limitation to how radically the country would be altered geopolitically and internally, right, towards its Western side. It's the people of Ukraine that had that, let's be honest, Banderite fascist national identity of Galicia, because there was no more there was no organized or political opposition within the country to that. They were lustrated, they were banned. And when the old Party of Regions, within a couple of years, managed to reform itself as the opposition bloc, and it threatened to then become the most powerful party in the country, more popular than Zelensky's own Servant of the People party. Then suddenly its leader, Medvedchuk, was found guilty of treason, and eventually it and all the other parties representing East Ukraine, everything that was not a Maidan party, was then banned, right? Its leaders, all found guilty of treason and everything. So it effectively became it's not a one-party state, but it is a Maidan party state. And there would be no revisiting it. There was no other political option allowed. You could not consider, a foreign policy as, hey, why do we want to be enemies with our biggest neighbor, right? Because that even social opinion was no longer allowed in the country, even though that represented, at least half of the country. At that time. And what a lot of people don't report on is that in 2014, while all this Maidan happened, right? Oh, they overthrew the corrupt Yanukovych government and brought this new corrupt Maidan regime in, pro-Western. But how many, it's democratic, right? I mean, how many people voted for that? Oh, wait a minute. No one voted for that? It was the overthrow of the government? Well, how many people supported it, right? Well, everyone did, right? That's what they say, everyone. No, they didn't, right? And as the then American owned and very pro-Western Kiev Post, very pro-Maidan, conducted at the time, while the Maidan protests were going on during those 3 months, every month they took polls, right, by still today respected Ukrainian polling countries. And every one of those polls showed that a majority or a plurality of the people actually opposed the Maidan protests. Now, it was a very small majority, right, or plurality. It was very close. But there's no question that there was no democratic revolution. It was the part of the country that lost the last election, seizing power and then excising the whole east of the country. And that is, what has led, to the decade of civil conflict in Ukraine, right? With, yes, Russia supporting quite obviously the Donbass, the eastern Ukraine, and quite obviously, the NATO and the West supporting the new regime that they helped install in Kiev. And that bring us right up to 2022. So for Trump, Team Trump, to catch up with 2015, well, yeah, that's quite an accomplishment, all right? But we're already a decade past that, and 3 years into a very intense and bloody war, a real conflict in Ukraine, all right? Having fought and defeated, right, what even Marco Rubio, the U.S. Secretary of State, finally admitted was a U.S. proxy war on Russia in Ukraine. And Russia, has the commanding heights of that conflict. For anyone who's has the slightest amount of honesty, at this moment and going forward. And we've also heard an admission from the Trump administration that, in the opinion of U.S. intelligence, that no current or future weapons package that the U.S., that the West could provide can match Russia's military industrial production and change that Russian advantage, that Russian dominance of the battlefield. So it's nowhere near close enough, right? It's laughable, even, right? Putin has repeatedly said what they would accept, right? You have to acknowledge that not just Crimea and not just Donetsk and Lugansk, but also all of Kherson and Zaporozhye had referendums. They voted to become part of Russia. They were enshrined in the Russian constitution. And you have to not only have the Kiev regime withdraw all of its remaining troops from those territories, but the West and Kiev need to acknowledge that they are part of Russia. All of them, not just Crimea. And if you don't do that, and you don't do it soon, well, then we'll just have to, create the geopolitical space, to ensure that safety. And, we'll see then similar referendums. The choice will be given to the people of Odessa and Dnipropetrovsk and Kharkov, and essentially, at the very least, all of Ukraine east of the Dnieper River.
Your point is that military will collapse at some point. And if you don't acknowledge the current scenario of these regions, then there will be more regions that end up part of the Russian Federation. That's your point. That there's
this is what Putin told a meeting of Russian industrialists and entrepreneurs, and that was obviously intended to be leaked quietly to the West, to the Western media and to the West. It certainly was printed in papers like Kommersant and so forth across Russia. So that is quite obviously where the Kremlin is.